600,000 people. That's the entire population of Cape Verde, 10 islands scattered off the coast of West Africa. No professional domestic league, no World Cup history, barely a dot on the map most fans could even find before this tournament. And for 90 minutes, plus 30 more, they made Argentina, the reigning world champions, look human, fragile, beatable. Here's the strange part. Cape Verde didn't even win that match. They didn't win a single game in regulation time during the entire tournament. And yet, almost everyone who watched them walked away saying the exact same thing. This was one of the greatest World Cup stories they had ever seen. Not because of the scoreline, because of everything it took just to get there. So how does a nation smaller than most American suburbs stand toe-to-toe with Messi's Argentina and make the entire footballing world stop scrolling, hold its breath, and watch? That's what we're getting into. Let's start with the islands themselves, because if you don't understand the geography, you don't understand the miracle. Cape Verde isn't one country in the way most people picture a country. It's 10 volcanic islands, most inhabited, scattered across the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles off the coast of Senegal. Some of these islands don't even have direct flights to each other. You want to get from one to the next? Sometimes you're looking at a boat, a prayer, and half a day. Now here's the number that changes everything. 600,000 people live on those islands. But over 1 million Cape Verdeans live somewhere else. Lisbon, Boston, Rotterdam, Paris. There are more Cape Verdeans outside Cape Verde than inside it. Sit with that for a second. A country where the diaspora outnumbers the homeland almost 2-to-1. Most nations lose a piece of themselves when their people scatter like that. Cape Verde didn't lose anything. It just grew roots somewhere else. This is a nation that exists more in memory and bloodline than it does in borders. A grandmother's kitchen in Massachusetts, a flag on a wall in a Rotterdam apartment, a Creole phrase passed down 3 generations deep in a country that isn't even Cape Verde. That's where this team was actually built. Not on a training pitch on the islands, in the diaspora. Because here's the part that sounds almost impossible. Cape Verde has no real professional domestic football league, not one that produces players at a World Cup level. No academy system pumping out prospects. If you built a team using only what's physically present on Cape Verdean soil, you wouldn't have a World Cup squad. You'd have a well-meaning amateur side that loses politely and goes home. So where did this team actually come from? They came from the children and grandchildren of people who left. Kids born in Portugal, in the Netherlands, in France, who grew up hearing about islands they'd maybe visited twice in their lives, who actively chose to play for a nation of 600,000 people instead of the football powerhouse that raised them. Think about what that means. A young player in Rotterdam, talented enough to maybe get a youth call-up from the Netherlands, looks at his family, looks at his blood, and says, "No. I play for Cape Verde. I play for the islands my grandfather crossed an ocean to leave." That's not a football decision. That's an identity decision. And identity, it turns out, might be the single most powerful ingredient in this entire story. Because a team assembled from 5 different countries, speaking 3 or 4 different accents of the same Creole language, raised on totally different continents, that team shouldn't have chemistry. It shouldn't have cohesion. On paper, it should fall apart the moment the pressure turns up. Instead, it became one of the most disciplined defensive units at the entire tournament. How do you explain that? You don't build tactical discipline like that with talent alone. Talent gets you noticed. It doesn't get you organized. What organizes a team like this is something older than football. It's belonging. It's players who feel like they're representing every uncle, every cousin, every grandmother who ever whispered the word Cabo Verde with pride in a country that wasn't Cabo Verde at all. And there was one man tasked with turning that emotional inheritance into an actual football team. A coach who had to somehow take players from 5 different footballing cultures, 5 different first languages of football, because tactics sound different in Portuguese than they do in Dutch, and forge them into a single unit, tight enough to frustrate Spain, hold off Uruguay, and eventually push Argentina to the very edge of elimination. That's not a job. That's closer to alchemy. And it didn't happen at the World Cup. It started years earlier in a qualification campaign almost nobody outside West Africa was paying attention to. Long flights between islands, players meeting teammates for the first time in a hotel lobby the night before a match. A federation working with a fraction of what Europe's giants spend on youth kits alone. Nobody was building the highlight reel back then. They were just trying to survive long enough to qualify. And somehow, against every structural disadvantage a football nation can have, they did. That's where the real transformation begins. To understand how Cape Verde ended up on a pitch in Miami trading blows with Lionel Messi, you have to go back to one man, Pedro Leitão Brito. Everyone just calls him Bubista. Before he was a coach, he was a center back, captained the national team for over a decade. Retired, stepped into coaching, worked his way up through domestic clubs on the islands, and in January 2020 took charge of the senior national team. Nobody outside West African football circles noticed. Why would they? Cape Verde had never sniffed a World Cup in its entire history. But Bubista had a philosophy, and it wasn't complicated. He believed a small nation could compete with anyone if it built two things: an identity players were desperate to defend, and a defensive structure so disciplined it made talent almost irrelevant. He started scouting the diaspora aggressively. Not just the obvious names, but kids in Portuguese lower leagues, kids in Dutch academies, players who might never get a senior cap anywhere else, but who had Cape Verdean blood and something to prove.
It's worth pausing on how unusual that approach actually is. Most national team programs wait for talent to find them. A scout spots a promising kid, the federation makes a call, and if the player's good enough, he says yes. Bubista couldn't afford to wait. He had to go looking. He had to convince 20-year-olds in Rotterdam and Lisbon that representing a country of 600,000 people, a country some of them had barely visited, was worth more than chasing a senior cap somewhere bigger. That's not scouting. That's recruitment of the heart. By March 2021, barely a year into the job, he had them qualified for the Africa Cup of Nations. A real result, but a modest one. Nobody was calling it historic yet. Then came 2023. Cape Verde reached the AFCON quarterfinals, their best run in years, before falling to South Africa on penalties. Painful, but it proved something. This wasn't a lucky run. This was a system working. By 2025, the football world outside Africa still barely knew the name Cape Verde. But inside African football, Bubista had already been named CAF Coach of the Year.
His team had quietly become one of the most organized defensive units on the entire continent. And then, on October 13th, 2025, in the capital city of Praia, in front of a crowd that had waited generations for this exact night, Cape Verde beat Eswatini 3-0. That result didn't just win a game, it qualified Cape Verde for the FIFA World Cup, for the first time in the country's history. Think about the size of that sentence. A nation of roughly 600,000 people had just become one of the smallest countries to ever qualify for a men's World Cup, behind only Iceland's fairy tale run years earlier. Fireworks over the islands, grown men crying in the streets of Mindelo, diaspora communities from Boston to Rotterdam waking up at strange hours just to watch a stream of a qualifier against a team most of the football world couldn't locate on a map. For one night, 10 scattered islands and every Cape Verdean living an ocean away from home became, briefly, the exact same place. They had done it! They were going to North America!
And then the World Cup draw happened, and the celebration got complicated fast. Cape Verde landed in a group with Spain, reigning European champions, Uruguay, two-time world champions with one of the most storied football histories on the planet, and Saudi Arabia, a team with far more World Cup experience and resources than they had. On paper, this wasn't just a tough group. It was, by almost every rational measure, an execution squad. Debutants don't survive groups like this. History barely offers exceptions. The usual script writes itself. Show up, get outclassed in Game 1, get mathematically eliminated by Game 2, and go home with a nice story about the experience and a few souvenir shirts. There was a phrase football commentators love to use about debutant nations: happy just to be here. It's meant kindly, but it's also a way of lowering expectations before a ball is even kicked. Nobody expects the happy to be here team to actually complicate things for the Giants. Nobody told Cape Verde that's how it was supposed to go.
Game 1, Atlanta, June 15th. Cape Verde versus Spain, the reigning European champions, a team built from some of the most expensive academies on the planet. 90 minutes later, the scoreboard read 0-0. Not because Spain didn't try. They dominated the ball, strung together the kind of passing sequences that make defenders dizzy, and threw shot after shot at a goal that simply refused to open. Standing in the middle of that goal was a 40-year-old goalkeeper named Vuzinha, a man who'd spent most of his career far from any spotlight, making saves that had commentators searching for new adjectives. He walked into that stadium with about 50,000 people following him online. By the time the final whistle blew, strangers across the world were already learning how to spell his name, and his notifications hadn't stopped buzzing since. That result alone should have been the headline of the tournament. A World Cup debutant holding the European champions scoreless on their first appearance on this stage against a team that had lifted a continental trophy the year before.
But Cape Verde wasn't finished making people recalibrate what they thought they knew. 6 days later, Miami. Uruguay, two-time world champions, a nation with a football pedigree measured in generations, not years. This time, the game wasn't quiet. It was chaos, end to end. Cape Verde fell behind, clawed level, fell behind again, and somehow found another equalizer before the final whistle, 2-2. A result that, on paper, sounds like a fun draw. In reality, it was Cape Verde standing toe-to-toe with football royalty and refusing to blink. Their coach, Bubista, was asked about it afterward. He didn't talk about tactics or formations. He talked about something simpler. Once you're on the pitch, he said, a lot of things become equal. As big as the opponent might be on the world stage, many national teams become equal. That sentence is worth remembering because it's the entire philosophy of this team in one breath. Game 3, Houston, Saudi Arabia. A team with real World Cup experience, real resources, real pressure to beat a supposed minnow.
Cape Verde locked them out too, 0-0. 3 group games, 0 losses. 3 of the toughest possible opponents a debutant could be handed, and not one of them left the pitch with a win over Cape Verde. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The part that makes the whole story feel even more human. Cape Verde didn't know yet if any of it was enough. Advancing out of the group didn't depend only on their own results. It depended on what happened in a completely different match, in a stadium they weren't even playing in. So picture this, a locker room, or a hotel room, or wherever a team gathers when the tournament isn't in their own hands anymore. Players who had just fought for 90 minutes against Saudi Arabia, exhausted, still in their kits or freshly showered, huddled around a screen, watching Spain play Uruguay. Not as spectators enjoying a good match, as a team whose entire World Cup dream now depended on a result they had zero control over, in a game happening miles away, decided by players wearing completely different jerseys.
There's something almost unbearable about that kind of waiting. You've given everything your body has for 90 minutes, and now your fate sits in someone else's boots. Spain won. And somewhere in that room, on a night that had nothing to do with their own legs or their own ball, Cape Verde discovered they were going through to the knockout stage for the first time in the history of their nation.
The celebration that followed wasn't loud in the way you'd expect from a team that just won a game. It was something closer to disbelief turning into joy in real time. Grown men who had spent their entire careers assuming this ceiling didn't exist for players like them, suddenly realizing it had just been shattered. And waiting for them in the round of 32 was a name that made the entire planet lean in a little closer. Argentina, the reigning world champions. Lionel Messi playing in what everyone assumed would be the final World Cup of his career. Cape Verde had already done the impossible just by getting here. Now they were about to try it again. Here's what almost nobody expected. Argentina didn't walk into that round of 32 match treating Cape Verde like an afterthought. By the time the draw paired them together, the entire football world had already watched Cape Verde frustrate Spain and trade blows with Uruguay. The scouting reports weren't condescending anymore. They were careful, respectful, almost nervous. Argentina's camp made a point of saying it publicly. Cape Verde hadn't stumbled into this stage by chance. They'd earned it, game by game, against 3 different footballing cultures.
And Bubista, for his part, wasn't interested in playing the role of the humble underdog who just hoped to survive. Throughout the tournament, he developed a quiet tradition. Before facing each opponent, he'd personally hand their head coach a small gift, a pennant featuring a map of Cape Verde's 10 islands with details of the match stitched onto the other side. Before the Uruguay match, he walked up to Marcelo Bielsa, one of the most studied tactical minds in the sport's history, and presented him with one. For me and for many other coaches, especially in Africa, Bubista said, Bielsa is a master. We've studied what he did throughout his career. Now, before the biggest match of his life, he walked up to Lionel Scaloni and did the same thing. Think about the psychology packed into that gesture. It's not a man asking for mercy. It's a man saying, I see you, I respect you, and I am not afraid of you. That's not the body language of a team hoping to lose respectably. That's the body language of a team that believes. And on the other side of the pitch stood the reason half the planet was tuning in regardless of who else was playing that day. Lionel Messi.
6 World Cups into a career that had already rewritten the record books, already the all-time leading scorer in the tournament's history, chasing goals in what almost everyone assumed would be his final World Cup appearance. He'd arrived in this tournament scoring a hat-trick in the opener and hadn't slowed down since, level with Kylian Mbappe at the top of the tournament scoring charts heading into this match. For Cape Verde, this wasn't just a football match. It was a chance to share a pitch with a player some of their own squad had grown up idolizing on grainy television broadcasts back on the islands. There's a strange, layered emotion in that, wanting badly to beat someone you've spent your whole life in awe of. Respect and ambition sitting in the same chest, refusing to cancel each other out. Their captain, Juan Mendez, 36 years old, the most capped player and the all-time leading scorer in Cape Verdean history, understood exactly what this moment meant. Almost certainly his only World Cup. A chance at the tail end of a long career representing a team the world barely acknowledged to walk out against the defending champions with everything on the line.
There was no illusion about the gap in resources. Argentina had strength and depth most nations dream about, a bench that could reshape almost any match in the world. Cape Verde had a squad built largely from lower-tier European leagues, one player from Europe's top 5 leagues, and a bond forged more by shared identity than by shared training facilities or shared budgets. But discipline doesn't care about resources. And belief, the kind Bubista had spent 5 years building inside this group, one diaspora recruitment call at a time, doesn't check a resume before it walks onto the pitch. The global press had already settled on their framing days before kickoff. David versus Goliath. The kind of headline that gets written about almost every underdog match and is almost never actually true. This time, a lot of people quietly wondered if it might be. July 3rd, Miami Gardens, Hard Rock Stadium, kickoff approaching. The stands filling with a strange mixture of neutral fans, curious tourists, and pockets of blue and white scattered next to pockets of the deep blue of Cape Verde shirts. Somewhere in that crowd, families who had flown in from Rotterdam, from Lisbon, from Boston, from islands most of the stadium couldn't place on a map, waiting to watch relatives they cheered for since childhood step out against the best player of their generation. On one side, a team trying to protect a legacy that already belonged in the history books. On the other, a team of 600,000 people trying to write a chapter nobody thought was possible. Neither side knew yet just how close this one was going to get. 29 minutes in, it looked exactly like everyone expected. Messi found a pocket of space, took a touch that seemed to slow the entire stadium down for half a second, and finished it clean. 1-0 Argentina. The kind of goal that makes you exhale and think, okay, here we go. This is how it was always going to unfold. Argentina settled. You could feel it through the screen. That particular sluggishness that creeps into a champion's legs when the job seems basically done. Passes got a little lazier. Pressing got a little slower. The kind of complacency that costs teams more often than anyone likes to admit. Cape Verde never stopped believing the door was still open. Just before the hour mark, De Roy Duarte found a half yard of space at the edge of the box and squeezed a shot into the far corner. 1-1. Hard Rock Stadium detonated. Not just Cape Verde's pocket of supporters, neutral fans, tourists, people who wandered in without a rooting interest, all of them on their feet for the team that wasn't supposed to be here in the first place. Somewhere in that noise, you could almost hear every kitchen in Massachusetts, every apartment in Rotterdam, every front porch back on the islands erupting at exactly the same second. 90 minutes came and went. 1-1. Extra time.
And this is where the match stopped being a good story and became something closer to folklore. 2 minutes into extra time, Lisandro Martinez whipped a finish into the top corner off the back post. 2-1 Argentina. The kind of goal that looks in the moment like the final nail. Like the story was about to end the way everyone assumed it would from the start. A brave debutante, a respectable defeat, a nice consolation narrative about how far they'd come. Cape Verde had other plans. In the 103rd minute, Sidney Lopez Cabral picked up the ball near the edge of the area, and what he did next will be replayed for years. A curling strike, bending away from the goalkeeper's outstretched hands, dropping perfectly inside the far post. 2-2. Cabral didn't even celebrate with his teammates first. He ran straight into the stands, toward the people who crossed oceans to be in that stadium, and disappeared into their arms. For a moment, one real, tangible moment, the biggest World Cup upset in the tournament's history felt inevitable. Through all of this, there was one man refusing to let the story end. Vozinha, 40 years old, standing on legs that had already made 8 saves that night, 4 of them off Messi alone, including 2 free kicks inside the exact range where Messi does the most damage to goalkeepers half his age.
A grandfather-aged shot stopper, going save for save with the greatest player alive in a stadium that had learned his name only 3 weeks earlier. Every time Argentina probed, Vozinha was there. Every time the pressure built, he found another save nobody expected from a keeper his age in his first World Cup against the greatest player of his generation. By the second period of extra time, both teams were running on fumes. Argentine players dropping to the turf with cramps in the Miami humidity. 111 minutes of football and emotional weight pressing down on every muscle on that field. And then, from a corner Messi swung in, Christian Romero rose above everyone and got his head to it. The ball deflected off Cape Verde defender Dini Borges on its way past Vozinha. 3-2. An own goal. The cruelest possible way for a story like this to turn. The final whistle blew minutes later. Argentina survives, Cape Verde eliminated. 22 shots for Argentina that night, only 10 on target. A team with a squad worth hundreds of millions needed a deflection off their opponent's own defender to survive a nation of 600,000 people. Some of the Cape Verde players collapsed to the grass, not from cramp, but from something heavier. Others stood, exhausted, and looked up at a crowd that was giving them a standing ovation despite the scoreline. Opposing fans, neutral fans, people who 20 minutes into the match hadn't cared which side won, now on their feet applauding a team that had just lost. They didn't win. Nobody who watched that match walked away thinking that was the point.
If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and come back every day. We tell these stories because football keeps handing us moments like this one, and there's nowhere better to make sense of them together. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Have you ever watched a team lose and still felt like you'd witnessed something you'll remember for the rest of your life? That specific, confusing mix of heartbreak and pride where the scoreline says one thing and your chest says another? That's exactly what an entire stadium in Miami felt on July 3rd. And it's what an entire nation felt, scattered across 4 continents, watching from time zones that had them waking up at 3 in the morning just to see it happen live. Tell me in the comments, has a team you had no real connection to ever made you feel that way? That strange loyalty that shows up out of nowhere mid-tournament for a country you couldn't have named a month before? Now, back to the islands. Because what happened after that final whistle might be even more remarkable than the match itself. Vozinha walked into that tournament with roughly 50,000 people following him online. A well-respected goalkeeper in football circles, completely unknown everywhere else. By the time he walked off that pitch in Miami, his following had exploded past 18 million. 18 million people in the span of 3 weeks learning the name of a 40-year-old shot stopper from a country most of them couldn't have located on a map a month earlier. Picture that shift from his side of the screen. A career spent in relative anonymity, playing for clubs and a national team that rarely made international headlines, suddenly waking up to messages in languages he doesn't speak from people on every continent, all saying some version of the same thing. Thank you for that performance.
That's not just virality. That's the entire planet deciding almost simultaneously that this story mattered. Highlight reels of Cabral's curling strike from the edge of the box started circulating within minutes, with commentators across different languages independently calling it one of the greatest goals in the tournament's history. Analysts who'd spent careers covering football giants found themselves writing entire columns about a goalkeeper's positioning, about a coach's diaspora recruitment strategy, about 10 islands nobody could confidently place on a globe. Argentina moved on, as champions do. 4 days later, they'd face Egypt in Atlanta, carrying the exhaustion of 120 draining minutes and the quiet knowledge of how close they'd come to an ending nobody in Buenos Aires wanted to imagine.
Cape Verde went home. But went home undersells what actually happened. They went home as the story of the entire World Cup. Not the eventual champions, not the flashiest attacking side. The story. The team every neutral fan on the planet had adopted somewhere between the Spain match and the extra-time heartbreak against Argentina. And there's one more piece to this, the kind of detail that makes the whole thing feel less like a sports headline and more like a real human ending. Not long after the tournament wrapped, Bubista stepped down as head coach. The man who took over in 2020 with almost no expectations, who spent 5 years building an identity out of scattered diaspora talent and stubborn defensive discipline, walked away from the job right after delivering the greatest achievement in his nation's football history. Bittersweet doesn't fully cover it. There's something almost poetic about a man building the exact thing he set out to build, watching it reach heights nobody thought were possible for a country this size, and then stepping aside rather than trying to chase the feeling a second time. He didn't leave because it failed. He left right after it succeeded beyond anything anyone could have reasonably promised 5 years earlier. He built something that will outlast his time on the touchline, and he chose to let it go at the exact moment it reached its peak. Which raises a question worth carrying into the ending of this story. What do you actually call a team that never won a single match in regulation and still became one of the most beloved stories in World Cup history?
So, what do you call a team like that? Not champions. The scoreboard already settled that question in Miami. Not even really an underdog story, because that phrase usually implies someone got lucky, caught an opponent on an off night, stole something they didn't quite deserve. Nothing about what Cape Verde did was luck. 3 clean sheets against 3 different footballing giants. A goalkeeper playing the game of his life at 40 years old. A team assembled from 5 different countries that somehow moved like it had trained together since childhood. Maybe the better question isn't what you call them. Maybe it's what they actually proved. They proved that 600,000 people, scattered across 10 islands, with no professional league to call their own, can build something that stands toe-to-toe with nations 100 times their size. As long as what they're building isn't talent alone, but identity. Something players are willing to choose over an easier path. Something a coach can shape into defensive discipline tight enough to frustrate the best attacks on the planet. They proved that belief isn't a soft, sentimental idea reserved for motivational posters.
It's a resource. It's the thing that gets a team through extra time against the defending world champions when the legs have nothing left to give. They proved that respect and ambition can share the same chest without canceling each other out. A coach handing a pennant to the very man he was about to try to eliminate. A squad idolizing the same players they were determined to beat. There was no need to manufacture arrogance to compete at that level. The respect was real, and so was the will to win. And they proved, maybe most quietly of all, that the story people remember from a tournament isn't always written by the team that lifts the trophy. Sometimes it's written by the team that walked off the pitch in defeat and still had an entire stadium on its feet. Think back to where we started. 600,000 people. No professional domestic league. Barely a dot on a map. And for one summer, they made the entire footballing world stop scrolling, hold its breath, and watch. Think about the images that will outlast the scoreline. A 40-year-old goalkeeper, arms outstretched, denying the greatest player alive for the 4th time in one night. A young forward curling in a goal for the ages, then running past his own teammates straight into the arms of strangers who had crossed an ocean to be there. A coach handing over a small pennant with 10 islands stitched onto it to men who had spent their careers being handed trophies instead.
Grown men in Rotterdam, Boston, and Lisbon watching a screen at 3 in the morning, feeling like they were finally, briefly, home. They didn't win a single match in regulation, and somehow they became one of the greatest stories this tournament has ever told. There's a version of that sentence that applies to more than just football. Somewhere in this story is a quieter idea about what it actually takes to matter. Not the biggest budget, not the most obvious advantages, but a group of people who refuse to be defined by what they lack, and who decide together that discipline and belonging can carry them further than anyone outside their circle ever thought possible. I'll let you sit with that instead of explaining it further. If this story meant something to you, follow the channel, and if you know 3 people who'd appreciate a story like this one, send it their way. Not because a number needs to go up somewhere, but because stories like Cape Verde deserve to travel as far as the diaspora that built this team in the first place. Leave a comment if this one actually got to you. A real one, not just a reaction. I read them, and I want to know which part of Cape Verde's run stayed with you the longest. And tell me what you want to hear next. There are 100 more stories buried inside this tournament.
And I'd rather chase the ones you're actually curious about. Until the next one.